All right, Rabbi, say good morning or good night, everyone. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning. Share to thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for Tafshin Pei the Tolson Mishpacha of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all the Sherman Drashos this year. It is Chus for Besoros Tovos for all of Am Yisrael. Our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Nisan, Paul Pollack, in celebration of the Nisan birthdays of his wife Kathy, granddaughter Tikva Esther, and the birth of a grandson, Teida and Jeremiah Pollack of Indianapolis, Indiana. An anonymous Talmud Torah sponsorship in the Chus of Simchas for all of our children, and for Nisan to be the month of Geula Shlema for Klal Yisrael. And Avram and Shane, the common memory of Avram's mother, Sarah, Brian Abbas, Yoshua, Heschel, Zichron Levrach. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshama Slav and Aliyah, the families, all those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Choli Yisrael. So the Baruch Hashem, Merit Hashem, bring home all of our hostages, B'Shalom and B'Karov, and our holy soldiers should be successful, B'Chol Maaseh Yedehem. But with that, let us begin. We have an incredible daf ahead of us today. Okay, so we'll say today's daf is daf ches 8. We are picking up in Meretz Hashem on Zayin Amud Beis 7b, and we left off at the Mishnah on the bottom. Nishmat habarzel mikato v'harag. So we'll say, interestingly enough, the Mishnah is going to delve into what is considered to be the paradigmatic case of killing someone b'shogeg, because it's the case that the Torah brings down. Literally translated, Reuben goes into the forest to go ahead and chop wood. And what ends up happening? The axe head falls off of the handle. Right? So as one can imagine, he's chopping wood, the axe head flies off the handle, kills Shimon. What's talacha? Rebi Omer Eino Gola. Rebi says he does not go to Galus. Now, we'll say, now understand, not go to Galus means what? That in other words, he doesn't get the punishment of Galus. Obviously, he's not going to be executed. There's no Chi of Misa, because this is not mazid. This is not intentional. So remember, as we've already saw in yesterday's daf, the punishment of Galus is really only applied in very specific scenarios. Very specific scenarios. So Rebi says, this type of case is not Galus. The Chum say Gola. The Chum say no, he does get Galus. Again, we'll explain that Machlokes in Meretz Hashem in the Gemara. That's case 1. Case 2, Mina Eitza Misbakea. Case 2 is Reuven is chopping wood. A splinter of wood flies off the tree and kills Shimon. Right? So case 1 is the axe head flying off the handle, killing Shimon. Case 2 is a splinter of wood coming off of the tree and killing Shimon. In case 2, Rabbi Omer Gola, Rabbi says, oh, this is the case of Galus. The Chum ain't a Gola. The Chum say no, he doesn't get Galus. Okay, so we'll say, so therefore these are our two cases. Says the Gemara, Tanya, Amar Rebbe the Chachamim. So Rebbe says to the Chachamim, V'chi ne'emar, v'nashal habarzel me'etzo. So Rebbe says like this. So remember again, what's the position of Rebbe? Rebbe holds that if the axe head flies off, no galus. If a splinter of wood comes off, yes galus. What's Rebbe's idea over here? So we'll say, so the lashon of the pasuk is, right, the pasuk itself is, Vasher yavo esre'ehu bayar, lachtov eitzim. Right? Reuven goes into the forest to chop wood. And what happens? V'nitche yado bagarzen lichros ha'etz, v'noshal habarzel min ha'etz. That's the expression. V'noshal habarzel min ha'etz. So Rebbe understands, so Rebbe says to the Chum like this. Does the pasuk say v'nashal habarzel me'etzo? Does it say that the axe head fell off of its handle or flew off of its handle? Etzo v'lo le'ne'emar ela min ha'etz. Rather, what it says is v'nashal habarzel min ha'etz. So something happened with the axe head, with the tree. So that's why Rebbe understands that the paradigmatic case of Galus is not where the axe head falls off of the handle, but rather where a splinter comes off the tree, or a piece of wood comes off the tree, and that's what kills Shimon. Furthermore, va'od ne'amar eitz lamata, v'ne'amar eitz lamala. Furthermore, again, it says eitz. Lower down in the pasuk, and then it says eitz above. Ma'etz ha'amar lamala min ha'etz ha'misbakea. So just like ultimately, again, eitz mentioned earlier, it's talking about a piece of wood from the tree itself. Af eitz ha'amar lamata min ha'etz ha'misbakea. So too, again, the eitz that is mentioned lower down, i.e. v'nashal habarzel min ha'etz, ultimately, again, it's talking about a splinter of wood from the tree itself. So I'll say, so therefore, halacha l'maisa, so Rebbe has really a twofold drush over, which we'll see in just a little bit. So part 1 is, it doesn't say v'nashal habarzel me'etzo, that the axe head fell off of its handle. That's issue number 1, right? And number 2, it says eitz twice in the pasuk. Just like in the beginning of the pasuk, it's talking about trees. So to v'nashal habarzel min ha'etz is talking about trees as well, not the axe handle. Okay, so that's the position of Rebi. The truth is, both the Chachamim and Rebi darshan the same pasuk. What's the pasuk? V'nasha habarzel mina eitz. So that's the phrase from the Torah. Literally, again, the barzel, the axe head, will come off of the eitz. Rebi savar yesh im lamasoras. So Rebi says, interestingly enough, we go ahead and we assign supremacy to the way that the word is read. So you see this type of machlokes many times before, means that when we look at how to darshan a word, we look at how it's read, how it's actually pronounced. The Rabbanan hold yesh im lamikra. We look at how it's written. Look at how it's written. Now, how does this play out? Well, let me actually read it. I'm sorry. Rabbi Savar yesh im lamasoras. Vinishal ksiv. Rebi says we look at how the word is read. Now remember again, the word as it's written in the Torah is vav nun shin lamed. That could be pronounced as not just vinashal but vinishal, as opposed to yesh em lamikra. If you look at how it's written, vav nun shin aleph, that's vinashal. So that's the machlokes. Now, what does this mean practically? Take a look at the last Rashi on the daf. Yesh em lamasoras. Rashi says, "Kimashinimtzira ksav shalteva lemoshe anu tzrichin ladarsha v'lo lefia mikra." So Rebbe holds like this: we look at how the word can be pronounced, not how the word is written. Therefore, kisha'ata kore v'nashal ata mosif havara shal aleph o shal hey bein nun l'shin ulefia masoras v'nishal ksiv uperusha v'nishal shehishal habarzel min ha'etz ha'misbakea umatz esre'ehu. So watch this. So Rebbe says when we look at the word as it's written in the Torah, we look at the way it's pronounced, or the way it could be pronounced, not the way it's written. It could be pronounced as v'nishal. Now what does v'nishal mean? If you were to read it like that, v'nishal habarzel min ha'etz means, and the barzel, the axe head, dislodged something from the tree. It dislodged it. So therefore, Rebbe understands that the paradigmatic case of killing b'shogeg that's mentioned in the Torah is where a splinter of wood comes off the tree that is being chopped and kills Shimon. That's the Gullus case. That's the Gullus case. On the other hand, for Rabbanan Sari, fitting Shadat Rashi, Rabbanan Sari, yesh im lamikra, v'nashal karina lashon pal habarza asmo v'nashal mi'aleitzo. The Rabbanan on the other hand say, no, look at how it's written. It's written as v'nashal. V'nashal habarzel min ha'etz literally means that the axe head flew off the handle and killed Shimon like that. So therefore, I just want to point out something very interesting over here. Right? Let's go through what everyone agrees with. Obviously, Reuven is not going to be executed for this case. Why is he not going to be executed? Why not? Right? No intentionality. Right? It's definitely a shogeg. It's what you call an accident. The shaila just is it the type of shogeg which results in gullus? Right? Because as we've already seen in yesterday's daf, not every case of accidental death results in an obligation to go into gullus, right, into exile. It's only very specific parameters or cases. So therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, Rebbe says, and what it all comes down to is, how do you interpret the phrase of v'nashal habarzel min ha'etz? So the Rabbanan will say, v'nashal, that's how it's written, v'nashal habarzel min ha'etz literally means the axe head falls off, or flies off of the handle. So therefore, the Rabbanan's case of gullus is the right. Reuven is chopping wood. The axe head flies off the axe head flies off the handle, kills Shimon. Reuven goes to gullus. The Rebbe says no. We look at the word and how it's read. Vinishal. Vinishal means the axe head dislodged something from the tree. It's when a splinter from the tree kills Shimon. That's the case of gullus. Incredible. So the Gemara says, one second. For Rebbe yesh in the Masorah, does Rebbe really hold that we go ahead and we look at the way that the word is the way the word is read? Is that really what he holds? Both side top of Chesam and Aleph. From Rabbi Yitzchak, on Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yehuda ben Roetz ubei Shammai Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Kiva kulu svirlu yesh em lemikra. So here's the problem: we have an explicit statement that says Rebbe holds yesh em lemikra, that when darshaning a pasuk we look as to how it's written, not how it's read. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, "Hainu dekamar lehu." You're right. It happens to be so. Whether it's a machlokes about what Rebbe holds, or really Rebbe holds yesh in lemikra. That's why, if you remember again, I'll say what else. Rebbe said two things. Rebbe said number one, v'nishal. He also made a gzera shava. It says 8 in the beginning of the pasuk and 8 in the end of the pasuk. Right. So the beginning of the pasuk is that a person asher yava esre'eo bayar lachtov eitzim. right? So there, trees in the beginning, the pasuk is clearly talking about trees. So therefore, he holds that when it says v'nashal habarzel min ha'etz, just like tree in the beginning of the pasuk refers ultimately again to actual tree, so to tree at the end of the pasuk, at the end of the pasuk doesn't refer to axe, it also applies only to tree. Okay, so that's why even if Rebi holds Yesh Ein Lemikra, he still has that Gzeira Shava. Incredible. Amra Papa, Man Dishada Pisal Diklas. We'll say, so again, so this is our fundamental machlokes Rabbi the Rabbanon, right? What is the biblically paradigmatic case of galus when it comes to chopping wood? Is it the axe head flies off and kills Shimon, or a splinter from the tree that Reuven is chopping flies off and kills Shimon? So we'll say, so now the Gemara gives a couple of other cases. Amra Papa, Man Dishada Pisal Dikla, Va'asi Tamri Va'azal Tamri V'katal, Baron Lemachlokes Rebi V'Rabbanos. Listen to this following case. Reuven takes a clod of earth, he throws it at a cluster of dates. The cluster of dates falls down and falls onto Shimon and kills Shimon. Heavy cluster of dates. Kills Shimon. Okay? So the Gemara says, by the way, this is the Machlokes Rabbi and the Rabbanon, right? Rebbe would hold that this is galus, similar to the splinter case, and the Rabbanon will hold that this is not a case of galus. Okay? So the Gemara says, Pshita. Okay, that's kind of obvious. Ma'adhim, what would you have thought? So the Gemara says, Ma'adhim, Kikoach kocho dami kamash bolan. So the Gemara says, I might have thought that maybe this is a case of secondary force, and everyone would agree that halacha l'maisa again, that there's no galus. Kamash bolan, no, that this case of the cluster of dates, is effectively the same case as the splinter. Whereas according to Rebi, ultimately, again, you'd go to galus. According to the Rabbanon, you would not go to galus. To which the Gemara says, Ela koach kochol l'Rebi heichem mishkachasla. So we'll say, according to Rebi, where would you ever find a case of secondary force which would not result in galus? What would be a case like that? This is interesting. Kigon, deshada pisa umachia legarma, va'azal garma umachia lekabasa, va'asa tamre va'azal tamri v'katal. So I'll say, what would be a case? What would be a case ultimately again of secondary force? Secondary force would be Reuven throws a clod of earth at a tree. The tree hits the branch hits the dates fall down on Shimon and kill Shimon. That would be a secondary force according to Reuven where you would not go to galus. Okay, we'll say, it's actually key. If you look at the lashon over here, the shada, right? You can almost write the shada piso machia lagarma v'azal garma machia lakavza v'asla tamre v'azla tamre. Right, chagad. And so you have a little bit again. So that would be a case of secondary force. Now, interestingly enough, how do we paskin here? Because we'll say, so again, what's interesting about this is everyone is agreeing, obviously, there's no death penalty over here, right? Because there's no intentionality. The question just is this, what is the shogeg case that would result in galus? So interestingly enough, the Rambam paskins like Rebi, which is quite interesting. So the Rambam says, Nishmat habarzal mina eita misbakeya eno gola. So interestingly enough, the way that Rambam paskins is that Allah if Reuven goes out to chop wood and the axe handle flies off the handle, again, Reuven's not chayiv obviously, but that's not the case of galus. Right? Ultimately, again, he holds that halacha l'maisa, that nishmat avarzal mina eitza misbakeya, right? That if the axe head falls off, you're not chayiv galus for that case, right? Again, it's an accidental death, but l'maisa no galus. He says v'china zorek even l'tamar lahabil tamar v'naflu min atamar latino kvargo. So interesting enough, so halacha l'maisa seems that the Rambam holds that the paradigmatic case of killing b'shogeg is a splinter of wood. That's the case. So Reuven's chopping wood, a splinter comes off from the tree that he's chopping, kills Shimon. That's the case of shogeg that goes to galus. It's interesting. Okay, so let's go back to Rabbi say we're going to spend a good amount of time on these type of cases because where we get into like what we call koach, kocho, we've seen this elsewhere as what we've called grama, causation. So we'll get into a lot of these cases as to what's galus. But just interestingly enough, at least the way the Rambam understands the pasuk is in accordance with Rebi, that v'noshal habarzal min ha'etz is not talking about where the axe head falls off, but rather again it's talking about where Reuven's chopping wood, a splinter of wood comes from the tree, and that's what kills Reuven. Well, that's what kills Shimon. Sorry. Next, so we'll say some more cases like this. Hazorek Evan Rosh Hashanah b'harag. Listen to this. Reuven throws a stone into Rosh Hashanah and he ends up killing Shimon. Kill Shimon Rishus Harabim. What's the halacha? Harei ze gola. This goes to galus. This goes to galus. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov Omer. Imichshiyata sa even miyada hotzi halas rosha v'kibla harei ze pater. So Elazar ben Yaakov introduces an interesting qualification. He goes like this. Let's say Reuven went ahead and he threw the stone. And at the time that Reuven threw the stone, there was no one in Rishus Harabim. No one was there. After Reuven released the stone, Shimon stuck his head out of his window, right, and extended his hand to the Rishus Harabim. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov says, Reuven's pater. There's no gullus in that case. Why? And again, interesting of the logic seems to be, since at the time that Reuven threw the stone, no one was there. Right? Shimon wasn't present. Therefore, again, Reuven can't be liable to gullus for that kind of case. Interesting. Zorak es ha'even lachatzero v'harag. Listen to this. What happens if Reuven is standing in his own yard and he goes and he throws a stone and he kills Shimon? Now Reuven's in his property. He kills Shimon in his property. Everything depends on what? Did Shimon have permission to be there? If Shimon had permission to be there, then ultimately, again, Reuven should have been more vigilant. And because Reuven wasn't vigilant, therefore he goes to galus. If, however, Shimon did not have permission to be there, then Reuven does not go to galus. Shneimar, Vasher Yavo Esre'ehu Bayar. Because remember, again, I will say the way the Torah sets up the case of killing B'shogeg is what happens, right? Two people are together in the forest. Why the forest? Just like the forest, right? Both Reuven and Shimon, the damager, right? Or I should say, the killer and the victim have the right to be there. So to the only time that there could be a liability for galus is when the victim had the right to be there. If, however, again, so therefore, this is very important. So again, what we're doing is we're slowly but surely adding on like the details to what creates a shogeg case which would result in galus. Right? So from the previous Mishnah, we've established again it's not the axe head, but ultimately again it is the splinter. From this Mishnah, we see now in order to be chayiv galus, the victim has to have had permission to be in that area. Right? If he did not have permission to be there, then there is no din of galus, which makes sense. Abba Shalom Rishal says, Macha Tavas Eitzim Rishos, Afkol Rishos. So it's very interesting. Abba Shalom says, furthermore, when you chayiv galus, when you accidentally killed someone engaged in what we'll call a rishos, an optional act, a non-mitzvah act. However, Yotza ha'av hamakes beno, v'arav harodes tamido v'shliach bezin. Let's say, however, a person was engaged in an act of a mitzvah which resulted in the death of a person. For example, now again, obviously, some of these are a bit societally, focused as well. So let's say a father is disciplining his child. Father is shooting his child, and he ends up hitting his child. Right, he ends up killing his child. Or a Rebi is disciplining his student, and he ends up. Which also, by the way, it is so important to understand that the way we discipline our children today has to be so fundamentally different. So fundamentally different. Right? We understand again. This is reflective of what happened. You know, what a slap could do today to a child in terms of turning them off in so many different ways. Right? Has to be understood. It doesn't necessarily mean that a little patch here and there can't. But again, has to be so incredible. In general, what we say to our children, how we discipline our children, what we choose to discipline versus what we choose just to kind of, ignore and let it be, is a very delicate dance in terms of the atmosphere in which we're being mechanech and hopefully raising Jewish children these days. Okay, the different discussion. But clearly the Gemara is talking about the idea that a father is physically disciplining his son. A Rebi is physically disciplining his student. So if let's say again a father kills his son, Chas v'shalom, a Rebi kills his student, ultimately again, or Shliach Bezdin. So this case is a little bit more understandable. Shliach Bezdin would be right. Bezdin is administering Makkos to someone. So again, remember, we'll talk about this as well in Makkos, but again, you had a court physician who determined how many Makkos a guy could withstand. So let's say, and he died. He just died. So the halacha is because all of these are mitzvah activities, therefore halacha l'maisa, there is no liability of galus for the person who ends up killing someone like this. Okay, so we'll say, so again, the point that Abba Shaul is trying to make is that the only time one is chayiv galus is if halacha l'maisa they are engaged in what we'll call a non-mitzvah activity. But if Reuven ends up killing someone when engaged in a mitzvah activity, ultimately, again, there's no galus for that. So it says the Gemara, we'll say what was the first case in Mishnah? First case in the Mishnah was Reuven throws a stone into Rosh Hashanah and kills someone. So the Mishnah says he goes to galus. The Gemara says galus. That's like amazing. They're both say again. Now, when the Gemara says amazing, what does that mean? Say you throw a stone that's capable of killing someone into a crowded public area. That's at least karov l'meisid, right? That's egregious. That's egregious. What are you talking about, galus? We're talking about shogeg. To which the Gemara says, Amrav Shmuel bar Yitzchak, b'sosras koslo. Oh, no. What's the case? Not literally throwing a stone. Rather, both of the case is Reuven's property is adjacent to the Rosh Hashanah. Reuven has a stone wall that he needs to demolish. As he's demolishing it, a stone falls into Rosh Hashanah and kills Shimon. To which the Gemara says, still, got to be careful. You got to be careful. And I will say what we're going to see, by the way, is in general, it's fascinating to see that on one hand, accidents happen. On the other hand, in the eyes of halacha, almost all accidents are absolutely preventable. Now, again, because there's another category of unpreventable circumstances, that's called ones. Shogeg, by definition, means an accident, meaning I did not intend to do anything, but had I been more vigilant, I could have prevented this. So again, obviously, I'm not going to be liable, for an intentional act of bloodshed if it was an accident, but there's still liability. This is the whole chap of galus, right? Because remember, again, if there was no fault for the accident, then why would you have to go to galus? Galus is a kapara. Kapara is only necessary if what? If you did something wrong, if there's some level of liability. So the mice, again, the fact that it said, it was an accident, that's fine. That's fine. You're not amazed, but you're still responsible for accidents as well. So the Gemara says, okay, I understand, Reuven, you didn't mean to kill Shimon when deconstructing your wall, but you should have been more careful. To which the Gemara says, no, B'sos koslo balayla. Reuven's doing it at night. He's doing it at night. So again, what's the pshat? He's assuming that at night there aren't people around. To which the Gemara says, still, you got to be careful at night as well. So just because it's at night, why does that give you a pass? To which the Gemara says, B'sos koslo la ashpa. Oh, it's an interesting case. Reuven is demolishing his wall, and he's kind of like demolishing it into a garbage dump. Right? Okay, so the first white line. Hi ashpa echidami. So what's the case of the ashpa? So the if there are people, right? If there are people commonly in the garbage dump, I don't know, low budget chalamite activity, whatever. Right? If there are people right in the garbage dump, so then lamaisa again the Gemara said poshehu, then that's negligence. That's negligence. Ilo shchichi barabim. But if people never come in the garbage dump, honestly, then I'll say that's an ones. So I'll say, by the way, I just want to point out, so you begin to see already these three very interesting categories, right? There's mazid, intentionality. There's shogeg, where it's an accident, but I should have been more careful and could have prevented this. And then there's ones, which is, I had no way, there was no way for me to prevent this. So again, if it's a garbage dump that people don't normally come into, so Reuven's just, he's demolishing his wall into a garbage dump, he had no reason to expect anybody would be there, so that's called an ones. Al ashpa ha'asuya lipanos balayla ve'ein asuya lipanos bayom. So also it's very interesting. So what are you talking about? I was saying now sometimes people would use a garbage dump also like as a public restroom. So we're talking about over here, that's why you have to be careful with people in a garbage dump. So what's the case? The case is where people use this garbage dump as a restroom, right? But ultimately, again, at night, all right, but don't use it by day. But sometimes people use it by day. In other words, it's primarily used at night by people, right? Not really used by day, but every once in a while, somebody will use it by day. Therefore, again, what's happening over here? Reuven is deconstructing his wall into this garbage dump, Poshea lohavi, and he's doing it by day. Poshea lohavi, deha eina asuri lipanas balayom. So again, on one hand, he's not a poshea, he's not negligent. Why? Because he had every right to assume that people won't really be there by day. On the other hand, ones nami lohavi, he's also not going to be an ones. Why not? Why isn't he an ones? The ika de mikri v'yasiv. because every once in a while people do come there by day. So this would be an interesting case of shogeg, right? Shogeg. So on one hand, he's obviously not intentional because he's doing it by day where people aren't normally there. On the other hand, he's also not an ones because again, people do come there by day. So if you're not a mazid and you're not an ones, what are you? Shogeg. Shogeg. Okay, that's the case. So Rabbi Yaakov is an interesting case, right? If Reuven throws the stone into Rosh Hashanah and the coast was clear, then after he goes ahead and he throws his stone, Shimon stakes his head out. So ultimately, again, Rabbi Yaakov said Reuven is pater. Reuven is pater. What's the logic? So umatza prat lamamtzias atzmo. So both said the lashon of the pasuk is umatza. Right, umatza esre'ehu. So matza esre'ehu means, right, so literally again, this was the splinter of wood. Splinter of wood finds Shimon. So that comes to exclude a case where Shimon makes himself available for death. In other words, so Lamaisa, in this case over here, Shimon stuck his head out of the window, put himself in the direction, right, in the path of the projectile. So therefore, again, Reuven's not going to be chayiv galus in that kind of case. Yaakov. So therefore, again, if when Reuven threw the stone, there was no one there, right? And then Shimon afterwards, after Reuven released the stone, Shimon stuck his head out of his window, thereby putting his head in the direction of the projectile. Ultimately, again, Reuven is going to be potter. Lememra, de matzah me karamashma. So that makes it sound like matzah, the lashon of matzah means something was there already beforehand. Right? There was like a pre-existing condition. Is that true? Or many, the Gemara says, but one second. Umatza prat lematzui shelo yimkar barachok v'yigal bekarov bera v'yigal beyafa. So what's this actually talking about? Steachuza. Right? By steachuza, if a person has ancestral land. So in general, if you sell off your ancestral land, you can force the purchaser to sell it back to you, right? Since it's part of your ancestral portion. However, again, the halacha is only so if you sold your ancestral land as like a last resort, right? You had nothing else to sell. But if, let's say, you had other property, but you still sold your ancestral land, you can't force the purchaser to sell it back to you. So, matzah prat lematzui. This comes to exclude someone who had other property. Shalim kabarachok v'yigal bakarov. Bira v'yigal bayafa. Amarava hachem mein yonei dikra v'hasa mein yonei dikra. So the truth is, matzah means different things based on context. For example, hasam mein yonei dikra umatzah dumyo devehisiga yado. So therefore, by steachuza, so again, matzah is comparable ultimately again to v'hisiga yado, that he comes into new money. Ma'asiga yado mehashta. Just like again, Ve'esiga Ada means he came into new money now. Af matzah nami mehashta. Hacha min yana dekran. Over here also, matzah is in accordance context. Umatzah dumya de ya'ar. The matzah is like the forest. How so? Ma ya'ar midi de isimikara. Just like the ya'ar, right? The forest was a pre-existing reality. Af matzah nami midi de isimikara. So to over here, in order for Reuven to be chayiv for killing Shimon accidentally, what has to happen? Shimon, so to speak, has to be present at the time that Reuven did his activity. But at the time that Reuven did his thing, for example, in this case, threw the rock, Shimon was not present. And Shimon only introduces himself into the equation after Reuven already threw the rock. There will not be liability for gullus in that case. Okay, incredible. Hazorik Esaven. Hazorik Esaven. So the Gemara says like this. Mimai. So the mechatavas eitzim derusha. So we'll say, so remember again, the end of the Mishnah was as follows. The end of the Mishnah spoke about this idea. Abba Shaul said that the only time you're liable for galus is when you are engaging in what we'll call a meiser rishus, right? We'll call an optional act, a non-mitzvah driven activity. But if you are engaged in a mitzvah driven activity, then halacha, and you end up killing someone accidentally, halacha, you're pater. So the Gemara says, and again, the Gemara darshins, Abba Shaul darshins, because the pasuk says, remember again, the pasuk says, "V'asher yavo esra'eu bayar lachtov eitzim." Right, Reuven goes into the forest to chop wood. So the Gemara says, just like chopping wood is an optional act, so too again, one is only chayiv galus if engaged in an optional act. But if you're doing something that is mitzvah related, then Allah chalamaysi you're pata from galus. So the Gemara says, how do you know that the pasuk is talking about chopping down wood for optional purposes? Dilma mechatavas eitzim de sukkah. Maybe he's talking about a person who's going to chop wood because he wants to build a sukkah, or someone's chopping wood because he needs wood for the pyre, for the pile of the mizbeach. Right? Even though a person, in other words, how do you know that we're talking about optional chopping of wood? Maybe it's mitzvah chopping of wood, and even though it's a mitzvah, the Torah still says you go to galus. To which the Gemara says, no, that's not a good example. I'll tell you why. I will say, there is no mitzvah to chop down wood for a sukkah, for schach. Right? There is no mitzvah to chop wood for the mizbeach. Meaning what? Let's say, for example, there's a pile of wood. Let's say there's a pile of schach. Right? Is there a mitzvah to chop down your own schach? No. Let's say you find a pile of wood for the mizbeach. Is there a mitzvah dafka to chop down wood for the mizbeach? No. So in other words, there's a mitzvah to have schach. Right? There's a mitzvah to have wood. There's no mitzvah to chop it down. So even if technically speaking you were going ahead and chopping it for the mizbeach for schach, halach l'maisa, that's still called an optional act. And you would not be chayiv. And you would not be put for galus from that. Eiser Ravina l'Rava Yatzaav Hamakes Benova Ravis Rodes Tamilo Shliach Bezdin. Listen to this. What I'm saying. So what about the case of the Mishnah? Right, the Mishnah said that if a father is disciplining his child and he accidentally kills him, a Rebbe is disciplining his student, accidentally kills him, a Shliach Bezdin is flogging someone, accidentally kills them, they're pater. Well, why don't we say pater from galus? Lema Kevan Deilu Gamar Lav Mitzvah Hashtenami Lav Mitzvah. Why don't we say like this? Let's take the case of the father. You know what? Maybe we should say like this. Since technically speaking, if the son was well behaved, his father wouldn't need to discipline him, right? And therefore, halacha l'maisa again. So maybe therefore the act of disciplining as well should be called mitzvah. What's with the Gemara? It's just like this. The same way that, let's say, for example, by the wood of the mizbeach, there's not a mitzvah to chop wood. What's the mitzvah? To have wood. But there's no mitzvah to chop wood, right? If I have wood, I don't have to chop wood. So it's like this. There's no mitzvah to discipline a child. What's the mitzvah, or what's the obligation of a parent? To have a disciplined child. Right? That's my obligation as a parent, to have a child who has proper discipline. It's just only if they're not disciplined that a parent has to discipline them. So maybe we should say that the act of disciplining isn't really a mitzvah. It's like a hechsher mitzvah, same way that the act of cutting down wood for a sukkah is not a mitzvah. Right? I need schach. It's just if there's no cut schach, I have to cut down wood. But the cutting of the schach is not for a mitzvah. So too again, the obligation of a parent is to have a disciplined child. That's the mitzvah. It's just if my child is not disciplined, so I have to do the work. So therefore, again, we should say the same thing. Therefore, if the father kills his son in the midst of disciplining him, he shouldn't go to galus. He shouldn't be exempt from galus. To which the Gemara says, Hassam, this is very interesting, Afagav de Gomir mitzvah. It's very interesting. Even if a son is disciplined, this is fascinating, it is still an obligation of a father to further discipline him. Dichsev, Yisar banecha v'yanichecha v'yitain ma'adanim l'nafshecha, which literally means, again, discipline your son and educate him, and he will provide delights for your soul. Shabbos said this is actually very interesting. So the Gemara seems to be indicating over here is that even if a child is well behaved, there is still an element of parental discipline that is absolutely necessary in order to maintain the child's proper path in life. Very interesting. So we'll say, so first of all, just in general, just as an aside, what's fascinating about this is, one of the things sometimes that we're so scared about in life is to tell our children no, because we think that if we tell our children no, especially today, every parent thinks if they tell their children no, my kid's going to go off the derech. So they go off the derech, tell them no. I have to give them every single thing that they want so that they should be happy, they should love me, they should love a Yiddishkeit. It's not true. It's not true. Right? Not disciplining your child is a shirking of parental responsibility. Allowing my child to do whatever they want is an abdication of parental responsibility. Your children do not need them to be your friend. How about kids have enough friends, but they only have one parent or two parents. They have one father, one mother. That's what they have. And the job of the parent ultimately, again, is to provide structure, to provide hadracha, and ultimately to provide discipline. And the parent who fails to do that ultimately is shirking their responsibility. So even if a child, it's interesting, even if a child is well behaved, the Gemara says, there still has to be an element of parental discipline that is present. It's fascinating. Hada Amarava, Lav Milsihi da Amri. So Rava comes along and says, you know what, forget about what I just said. Let's go on a different approach. He says, Va'ashayava Esri Ehu Bayar. Right? What does the pasuk say? The pasuk talks about again where Reuven comes in contact ultimately again with Shimon in the forest. So again, the forest represents a totally optional act. You want to come in, you don't want to come in. If we were talking about a mitzvah act, so how can you say that ultimately, again, you have the right to choose if you come in or you don't come in? So the Gemara says, so you're telling me wherever it says the word asher, asher always means something optional. So we'll say the pasuk over is talking about a person who becomes tamei, doesn't become tahar, and enters into the Beis Hamikdash in a state of tumah. Such a person is chayiv kares. So but he used lashon of asher. So what are you saying? Ibai mitma, ibai lo mitma. Are we talking about a case of a person who had a choice whether or not to become tamei? What about the Gemara says mitzvah? What about mitzvah? The lo sagi, the lo mitma, hachinami depater. So what about a case of mitzvah? Are you going to say that the pasuk says asher? So maybe asher means like this. Only in a case where you had the choice to become tamei, that's when you enter into the Beis Hamikdash, you're chayiv kares. But if you didn't have a choice about becoming tamei, and you enter into the Beis Hamikdash in a state of tumah, you're not chayiv kares. So, for example, then again, a case of mitzvah, where both say again, a person comes across a mitzvah, you don't have a choice. You have to take care of the mitzvah. Would you say that therefore, because I didn't have a choice, I had to do it? Therefore, if I enter into the Beis Hamikdash in a state of tumah, I'm not chayiv kares. That's not true. That's simply not true. Shiny Hasam, the Amikra, both says in the pasuk there, it says on the base, Tamei Yihya Mikamakom. Now, because there the pasuk is Tamei Yihya, where the Torah clearly indicates that however you became Tamei, whether you became Tamei in an optional way or you became Tamei in a non-optional way, halacha l'maisa, if you enter into the mikdash in that state of tumah, you are chayiv kares. To which the Gemara says, no. Tamei Yihya is needed for something different. What does that teach me? L'chidisanya Tamei Yihya l'rabos tvul yom. So this is very interesting. Tamei Yihya actually teaches me tvul yom. Who's tvul yom? Remembering tvul yom is the guy who is tamei. What did he do? He went to the mikvah, but he's still missing what? Head of Shemesh, nightfall. If that guy goes into the Beis Hamikdash in a state of tumah, he's also chayiv kares. In other words, I would have thought that maybe a tvul yom is not chayiv kares. Therefore, the Pasuk says Tamei Yihya. As long as your tumah is upon you in some way, shape, or form, and you go into the Beis Hamikdash, you are chayiv kares. So the Gemara says Tumaso bo l'rabos mechusar kippurim, and Tumaso bo comes to include ultimately mechusar kippurim, someone ultimately again who went to the mikvah, maybe even had hair of shemesh, but is still missing his requisite karbanos to be mitar himself. Amarlei. Ana me'ot tumaso kamina. Ike demasni laha. So we'll say others have a different approach to this conversation. Listen to this. So the Gemara says, b'charish u'bakatzar tishbos. Suppose this is very interesting. So the pasuk over here, b'charish u'bakatzar tishbos is like this. Sheishes yamim tas. Listen to this. Sheishes yamim tavod. For 6 days you will work. U'bayom hashvi tishbos. Becharish of a katzir tishbos. On the 7th day you shall rest. Becharish, literally plowing. Katzir, harvesting. Tishbos, you shall rest. Now, both say we're going to see over here. It sounds like it's talking about Shabbos, but it doesn't make sense that it's talking about Shabbos because we already know the Malachos of Shabbos. So therefore, both say interestingly enough, the Gemara understands where that's talking about Shemitah. Shemitah. Okay, so now listen to this. Becharish of a katzir tishbos. Rabbi Kiva Omer. Rabbi Kiva says, Eino. Sorry, Charish Shal Shvius v'Katzir Shal Shvius. Now, even if it goes with Shemitah, I don't need this pasuk to teach me that I can't plow and I can't harvest during Shemitah. I already know this. How do I already know this? Shari Kvar Ne'amar Sadcha Lo Sizra V'Karmacha Lo Sizmar. Because the pasuk already says, literally, don't plow your field and don't prune your vineyard. It already tells you about the prohibition of Shemitah. Ela afilu Charish Shal Erev Shvius. Shenichnas l'shvius, v'katzir shal shvius sheyatza l'matzei shvius. Rather, what is it coming to include? It's coming to include even plowing of the 6th year that benefits the 7th year, or things that grow during the 7th year that ultimately mature during the 8th year. That those items have an element of Shemitah sanctity as well. Rabbi Shmuel says, Ma'charish rishos, av katzir rishos. Rabbi Shmuel says, no, it comes to teach you like this. It comes to teach you that halacha l'maisa, just as plowing is an optional act, so too harvesting is an optional act. That's when there are these prohibitions. Yatsa Katsir HaOmer Shum Mitzvah. What does this come to exclude? This comes to exclude the harvesting of the Omer, which is not an optional act, but rather is a mitzvah. How do you know they're talking about a plowing of a rishos? Dilma Charishas Mitzvah. I'm sorry, Dilma Charishas Omer, the mitzvah. Maybe he's talking about, again, the plowing that is done in order for the Omer, right? I'm going to plow the field to plant barley for the Omer, which is a mitzvah. And even so, and even so, the Torah says, still can't do that. Still can't do that. Amrle, Kevan de Matzacharosh and Choresh, Lav Mitzvah. Said, no, because it's different. Because after all, Rabbi say, there is no mitzvah to plow, right? Because if you already found the plowed field, it's not like you have to plow a different field ultimately for the Omer. Say, Servina the Rava, Yotza Avamakes, Benova Ravaro. This is the same conversation as we had before, just a little bit of a different approach. Shavina's question to Rava, what about the following case? The Mishnah said, if a father is disciplining his child and he kills him while disciplining him, or Rebbe is disciplining a student and kills him while disciplining him, or Shliach Beis is flogging someone and kills him, so what's the halacha? Pater from Galus. Why? Because it's a mitzvah. V'amai, lema kevan de ilu gomer lav mitzvah, hashtanami lav mitzvah. Why do we say something over here? Since if the son was disciplined, the student was disciplined, the person, right, was disciplined, that Allah said there'd be no mitzvah to do these things. Maybe even now it's not called a mitzvah. To which the Gemara says, no. Hasam, hashtanami lav mitzvah. Hasam afagav, the first white line. Hasam afagav the gomer nami mitzvah kamen. It's different. By the case of disciplining, even if the child is disciplined, even if the student is disciplined, there is still a mitzvah of further discipline. Okay, to which the Gemara says, Hadar Amarava, Lav Milsihi da Amri, Kitsira Dumri de Charisha. So ultimately, as Rava says, one second, let's revisit that which we said before. The Torah is comparing the harvesting to the plowing. Macharisha Matzacharosh Eno Choresh, just like by Charisha. We'll say if you found a plowed field, you don't have to plow it again. It's about for carbon omer, right? If you found, let's say I need to plant, I need to plant barley for the carbon omer. I already found the field that is plowed. There is no mitzvah to go out of my way to plow another field for the sake of omer. I'm at a foot af katsira nami matzah katzer eno kotzer. So I'll say I'm at a thought also that Allah say if I already find cut barley, I don't have to harvest more barley. Mitzvah liktor al-havi. So the Gemara just ends up, by the way, that's not true. Interestingly enough, when it comes to the carbon omer, by charisha, by plowing, if you already found the plowed field, there is no mitzvah to plow again for the sake of planting barley for the omer. But they both say, let's say for the ktsira, let's say for the harvesting, if you found cut barley, right? Can you use that for the omer? The answer is no. Right? Rather what? In order to be Yotzei for the mitzvah of the Omer, you have to actually what? You have to actually harvest that barley. I just want to point out how beautiful is this, right? We're learning about carbon Omer. Carbon on the third day of the Omer today. Third day of Sirah. It's interesting, by the way, just to understand, by Sirah Omer, just as an aside, by Sirah Omer, there's two different girsos of Hayom Shlosha Yamim La Omer and Ba Omer, right? So what's the machlokes? So remember again, it's very lemaisa. La Omer goes, assuming that you are counting from the time that the carbon was offered. Hayom Shloshim La Omer means today is the third day since the carbon Omer was offered. Ba Omer reflects the idea that there is not yet a carbon Omer. So therefore, again, Ba Omer means not from the carbon Omer, but in the counting of the days of the Omer. That's why it's interesting that the majority of opinions actually say contemporarily one should say Ba Omer and not La Omer. You only say La Omer when there's an actual carbon Omer that's brought. Otherwise, if there's no carbon Omer, I'm not counting from the carbon Omer. I'm counting Ba Omer. I'm counting right in the count. So interesting, Rabbi Soloveitchik. His yard site was yesterday. First day Chalamayid. So the Rav actually had an interesting minhag. I don't know if it was his minhag or maybe from his father beforehand to actually say both. To actually, when counting it, say Hayom Shlosh Yamim Ba Omer, and then afterwards to say Hayom Shlosh Yamim La Omer. Again, there's nothing wrong with saying both. Right? Nothing wrong with saying both. So therefore, again, you get both opinions. But interestingly enough, I don't know what they have. I don't know what they have printed on the art scroll. think I saw in the Machzor they have Ba Omer. But okay, all right, whatever it is. Any event, so just, you should know, get in Yoni the Yomi. In any event, both say. So for our purposes, by the way, the Gemara just ends off by saying, so Omer is a little bit different. Halacha might say if you were to find cut barley that would not satisfy the obligation, you would have to go ahead and recut new barley for the sake of carbon Omer. Okay, both say, bottom line, our takeaways from this Mishnah is that halacha l'maisa, although the sugya did not get so into it, but at the end of the day, two important takeaways. Number one, you are only chayiv for galus if you kill someone when engaged in what we'll call an optional discretionary act. But if one is engaged in a mitzvah, and that results in the accidental death from someone, there is no galus. So therefore, if a father is disciplining his child, again, the parameters of that would be very interesting, or a Rebi is disciplining a student, or let's go with the Beis Din case, right? Beis Din is administering a punishment, and right, the Sheh Beis Din kills someone, those are considered mitzvah acts. One would not go to galus for those acts. You only go to galus in a case of an optional discretionary act. That's number one. Number two, although the Gemara didn't really spend that much time with it, is halacha l'maisa says only galus if both parties, right, or if the victim has the right to be where he is. But if ultimately, let's say again, Shimon is trespassing on Reuven's property, and Reuven's practicing archery, right? And Reuven kills Shimon, then halacha l'maisa there's no chi of galus over there because Shimon had no right to be there. All right, well, so let's go a little bit by the Mishnah. Ha'av gola al yidei haben, va'ben gola al yidei ha'av. So we'll define exactly what this means. But literally, again, a father is exiled as a result of killing his son, and a son is exiled as a result of killing his father. Okay, like I said. Well, now, B'Pashtus, what this means is a father kills his son b'shogeg, or a son kills his father b'shogeg. Halach l'maisa, they go to galus. Hakol golden al yidei Yisrael. Everyone is sent to galus as a result of killing a Jew. Right, that's what it means. V'yisrael golden al yidehen, and a Jew is exiled, whoever he kills, chutz mi ger toshav, with the exception of a ger toshav. The ger toshav eino gola al yidei ger toshav, and a ger toshav is only exiled as a result of another ger toshav. We'll have to see exactly what this means. Remember again, a ger toshav is a non-Jew who lives in Eretz Yisrael, who repudiates idolatry, and ultimately goes ahead and observes Shemes as Bnei Noach. Says the Gemara, Ha'av gola al yedei haben. So one second, you tell me that if a father kills his son, that ultimately again he goes to us. But we just learned, Va'amrit yatsa ha'av hamakes b'no. But we just learned that Lamaisa, what was the previous Mishnah? We just learned that if a father is disciplining his kid and ends up killing him in the midst of disciplining him, that Allah Lamaisa, the father doesn't go to galus. To which the Gemara says, no, the Gamir. What are we talking about? A well-behaved child. The child's already disciplined. He's already disciplined. And therefore, again, the father had no need to hit him. But we said before that even if the son is disciplined, there's still a mitzvah for the father to further discipline him. Bishulya dinagri. Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about ultimately, again, a carpenter's apprentice. Right? The case over here is ultimately, again, where the father is teaching his son carpentry. The son is not paying attention. The father disciplines him in order to get him to pay attention, and he ends up killing the son accidentally. That'll be the case of galus. To which the Gemara says, I understand, shulya denagri chiyusahu, but that's teaching your son a trade, right? That's teaching your son a parnasa, right? And the Gemara says, Chiyusihi, right? Delamde. We'll say a father has an obligation to teach his son a trade, much in the same way that a father has an obligation to teach his son Torah. Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Chiyusihu, V'afagav the mitzvah la'avlamdu di'afinu le'mikra perakam de'kiddushin. The cause of ra'achayim isha sherahavta. Hikish umnos shu isha kidichsev k'chu b'nechem nashim. So it's interesting. The Gemara darshans the same way that a father has an obligation to marry his son off. And by the way, marry his son off doesn't just mean marry his son off. It means that a father has an obligation to teach his son how to be a proper husband, right? How to maintain a proper marriage, how to maintain a proper home. Not just find the shidduch, but model for him the right behaviors as to how to be a proper Jewish husband. So too, again, a father has an obligation to teach his son a parnasa. So therefore, again, I will say, Lemaisa, again, if a father is teaching his son a parnasa and is disciplining him so he pays attention and accidentally kills him, the pashtus, that should be called the performance of a mitzvah, and he should have it from galus. The gamer umnase achrisi. No. It's where the son already had another trade. He had another skill set. Father's teaching him. So therefore, again, he already knew what he needed to know in order to maintain himself in life. Father's teaching him an additional trade. Okay, he wants him to have a plan. Life, by the way, what does it mean teaching him an additional trade? You know what else the father has to teach his son in life? Right? How to have a plan B. We'll say one of the most important yisodos in life is to learn how to pivot. Because a lot of times in life, right, things don't go the way we planned. And I will say there are two different kinds of people in life when things don't go according to plan. There are people who fall apart, and people who don't know how to move forward, and people who learn the power of the pivot. One of the most important things that we teach our children is how to pivot. That's why, we'll say, we know what the most teachable moments in life are, the most incredible teachable moments of chinuch for our children is how we deal with stressful situations. Our children learn so much about us and about life from how we deal with stress. And when our children see us fall apart, and our children see us lose it, and our children see us lash out in stressful situations, that's how they too will deal with stress as well. But if my child sees me under stressful situations, under pressure, I got this. I know inside, I don't got this, right? I do not have this. I don't have any control over this situation. I don't know what to do. But I know that I'm going to keep a cool head. I'm going to be menschlich. I'm going to be proper. I'm going to be measured. I'm going to be even keeled. I'm going to figure this out. That is the most tremendous chinuch we give to our children. So therefore, Rabbi say, interesting enough, the father in question over here, he already taught his son as parnasa, but this father also understands that in life, you got to teach your kid a plan B, an active plan B, and also again, in general, how to deal with life when things don't go according to plan. But because it's a plan B, therefore it's not a mitzvah. Because it's a mitzvah, therefore if the father ends up accidentally killing his son in the midst of teaching him this secondary parnasa, halacha l'maisa, again, he will go to galus for that. So we're going to stop over here for today. Tremendous shkoyach. What a daf. Shkoyach, everyone, a good night. Continue tomorrow. On Zoom, have a great day. A good night, everyone. No, I know Shalom.